Welcome, everybody. Now that the recording is up and running, I think we'll get going. So this is the second in our series of webinars called GGR Insights that we're hosting here in the Core Hub, where we share some of the latest research carried out by Core and discuss what it might take to enable the sustainable scale-up of greenhouse gas removal, or GGR for short, in the UK. Just a reminder that all these webinars are being recorded and they will be put on our website. So that means you are welcome to relive this experience once it's done and come back to the information that you pick up here. Just for those of you who don't know, the Core Hub is the UK's national research effort on greenhouse gas removal. It's funded as part of UK Research and Innovation's wider greenhouse gas removal demonstrators programme. Core does the coordination work across the programme, and we also carry out multidisciplinary and really quite solutions-focused research on greenhouse gas removal. So today we're talking about policy. In the world of greenhouse gas removals, a lot of attention goes very rightly towards the exciting new technological innovations going on. Maybe it's a new way to do direct air capture or a new process for using little known and unloved biomass wastes to sequester carbon that they contain. But talk to technology developers and very quickly you will hear from them that one of the major barriers to growth at the moment is the lack of reward for doing the carbon removal. In economics speak, we'd say that carbon removal is a public good and one for which there generally isn't a market or some other obligation or responsibility for doing it. So there's a natural role here for governments to create that reward system. As much as we need new technologies, we need new policies. But which policies are possible and which policies might be better or worse? Well, I'm delighted we've had a team of economists thinking through this question in Core. And one of them, Johanna Arlinghaus, is here to present some of the work that's been done. So I'm delighted to welcome Johanna. She is Assistant Professor of Economics and Sustainability at the Hertie School in Berlin. And she's a senior associate here at Core because before moving to Berlin, she was a postdoctoral researcher with us here. So it's great to have her back. And she'll be presenting recently published research on a taxonomy of policies for removals. I'm also delighted that we get to have with us Francesca Battersby. She's Senior Policy Analyst at Carbon Gap. She's an expert in emerging government-led policies for removals in the UK and in Europe. And until very recently, she actually chaired Core's Future Leaders Network, which is a network of about 150 young professionals now, all working in various fields relating to greenhouse gas removals. And I'm also delighted we have with us Paul Davies. He is founder and director of the Coalition for Negative Emissions, which brings together, I think now over 20 corporate and industry groups all focused in this area. And Paul himself has extensive experience and a background in finance, having worked for the likes of PwC and HSBC in the past. So they'll be providing their thoughts in response to this research. You as the audience, we'd love to hear your thoughts too. So if you go to the bottom of your Zoom window, I hope you can see the Q&A button. Please use that rather than the chat button, but we'd love to hear your questions as we go along. So if you can type in your questions using the Q&A function, and then if you see questions that you like, please upvote them. We'll cover as many of the popular questions as we can in the Q&A time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Johanna to present her work. Johanna, over to you.
Great. So I think this is now working correctly.
Perfect, yes.
Great. Welcome everybody to this webinar, and thank you also for the kind introduction, Steve. I'm very happy today to be presenting an analysis that is joint work with my colleagues Xiu Feng, Joseph Stemler, Sam Fankhauser, and Steve, who you all just met. And in this policy paper, actually, we're developing a taxonomy of policies to support geological carbon dioxide removal. And if you're joining this webinar, I don't think that I need to explain in detail that CDR, in combination especially with deep, rapid, and sustained reductions of greenhouse gas emissions that we should not forget about, is actually vital to reach net zero goals. Since not all emissions can be eliminated, especially not those from hard-to-abate sectors, carbon dioxide removal is actually necessary to remove these residual emissions. And at the same time, although we've known this for a while, the CDR efforts that are currently proposed by countries fall way short of those necessary that are foreseen by integrated assessment models that are calibrated to reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 degrees of warming. Many of the technologies that underlie this geological CDR are in pilot or very early commercial stages, thus necessitating policy support to actually bring down costs and make them viable investment option. However, since carbon dioxide removal is actually quite a nascent policy domain, we don't have a lot of evidence on policy design and also not many experiences with implementing these policies. And this is where we actually hope to come in by providing a taxonomy of the main policies that are implemented or under consideration to support geological CDR. So we choose 4 broad evaluation criteria that we deemed to be important, but that is also rooted in economic analyses of pollution control, so mitigation policy. These are stringency, basically policy effectiveness, efficiency, feasibility, but also strategic fit, so considering how these policies actually fit together. And using these criteria, based in prior literature, mostly from within economics, we evaluate these most commonly discussed policies. And we don't just evaluate them in isolation, but we also assess policy combinations and their interactions, especially focusing on technology development and innovation, because this is of obvious relevance to the CDR policy domain. Lastly, in the working paper that we published, we apply these criteria to CDR policy in the EU, the UK, and also in the US. But today we want to talk about the UK mainly. Of course, if you have questions about the EU, most welcome as well. We focus on geological CDR. Why is that? Geological CDR technologies are effectively permanent when it comes to their timescale of storage, which is actually in the order of thousands of years. And as a result, only geological CDR can ensure a durable net zero without having to repeat removals all the time. And this is in contrast to so-called nature-based solutions, which have a higher risk of re-release of the carbon that is captured and thus need to be permanently renewed in order to sustain net zero permanently. 2 of the most prominent technologies that you will all be aware of are bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS, and direct air carbon capture and storage. And early activity actually was driven mostly by voluntary private purchases. And more recently, there have actually been bigger announcements by governments for pilot plants in several EU countries. And also the ramp up of the DACS technology is going quite swiftly in the US. Nevertheless, the total deployment remains quite limited to date. And colleagues in Oxford have actually surveyed investors, finding that this is due to lack of demand and also due to long-term policy uncertainty that impedes these larger investments from happening. And so key challenges in policy that we hope to inform are actually for CDR technologies to reach scale, to prevent mitigation deterrence, to ensure the integrity, but also the fairness of CDR policies, among others, to taxpayers, but also accelerating the speed of the ramp up of CDR technologies. We actually include a range of policy instruments in this survey or taxonomy that we put together. For example, we consider the integration of removals in emissions trading systems. And for each of these policies, we propose a benchmark policies. Since these potential policy designs are so broad for the case of integration of removals into ETS, we mainly want to highlight that for ETSs, it will be crucial to actually strengthen the cap, tighten the cap to maintain these removals and to ensure that the ETS prices are not eroding as a result. As a CDR example that also we put together a list of for each of these policies and that don't necessarily conform to the benchmark, of course. We can name the Japanese emissions trading system that actually already accepts permanent removals, but also the UK and the EU ETS are considering integrating negative emissions into their emissions trading systems. Several other systems, for example, the New Zealand ETS also accept offsets that are not necessarily permanent though. Tax breaks is the policy of choice in the US, most famously via the 45Q tax incentives. In the ideal case, a tax break would provide a per ton credit for the social value per ton of carbon removed. And it is conceivable that additional tax breaks would be given for the upfront investment into infrastructure. The voluntary carbon market, again, in the ideal version, would be characterized by a high degree of participation from high-impact firms that purchase voluntary carbon credits that also reflect the social value of removals. And we all know that this is currently not necessarily the case, but would ideally, of course, also be characterized by very stringent monitoring, reporting, and verification. In terms of examples of permanent geological project credits that are traded on the VCM, we can name the project Hummingbird in Kenya, as well as the Vahara startup, which actually explores enhanced rock weathering in India. For the extended producer responsibility, we haven't really found examples in practice. However, a number of researchers in Oxford are proposing the carbon take-back obligation, under which actually firms would remove a decreed amount of carbon that is proportional to their produced carbon emissions. Advanced market commitments actually foresee a policy under which firms commit to an amount of removal purchase. In the ideal form, again, at a cost that reflects the social value of removals. An example of that is the famous AMC by Frontier mentioned on the slide. Almost lastly, we have direct grants and subsidies that are ideally targeted to removal technologies that yield the maximum removal volumes per pound invested. And in a good example of a grant that supports geological removal quite effectively are the Swiss grants under the Climate and Innovation Act. Now, lastly, carbon contracts for differences provide a price top-up to a chosen reference price for removal. That reference price can be the ETS, for example, be that the UK or the EU one, or also the price provided under the voluntary carbon market. And ideally, the strike price schedule should be high enough to cover removal cost and minimize expenditures, while also allowing for cost decreases in learning. So basically these cost decreases in the removal technologies that we are hoping for when we provide policy support. Since carbon contracts for differences are actually a policy that is meant to provide longer-term certainty, it is in practice not really clear how this can be best provided. So how to balance this price stability with at the same time being more flexible to providing cost adjustments. So I now turn to how we evaluate these policies within our evaluation matrix. As I mentioned earlier, we came up with 4 broad categories: stringency, efficiency, feasibility, and strategic fit, with a few questions that we actually use within these categories to assess the policies at hand. So this slide has a selection of the most important policies that we evaluate in the paper. The full table is in the working paper. I have provided the link at the end of this presentation. And we also have a very detailed table that goes much beyond the color coding actually in the full paper appendix. Also note that this assessment must be very high level, implying that there are many design details that this analysis can not take into account. But I know that there's current work going on, both at in the Core Hub, actually, to explore how these policies might be working in more detail. So that's a highlight for what will be coming up in future work. Under stringency, just to provide an example of how we actually evaluate these policies, our first and most important question is whether the policy can provide sufficient incentives to encourage removals at the scales required to reach net zero goals by 2050. And while the answer, of course, again, depends on the details of the policy design at hand, we argue that most of the policies on this slide can actually reach these scales or have the potential of reaching these scales, except perhaps the voluntary carbon market, which by its very nature is voluntary and as a result subject to the priorities of investors and also investor sentiment. And the next 2 questions evaluate whether the policy can provide sufficient legal, but also price, risk and return certainty to attract sufficient private investment. Again, our overall evaluation of this for many of the policies that we consider is relatively positive. Or we are not extremely sure, for example, in the case of the CTBO, which has currently not been implemented, so it's a bit hard to assess its impact. When talking about tax incentives and direct grants, we were not entirely sure as well, because actually these policies can be adjusted quite swiftly in response to politics and government priorities, which is why we have given them an unclear but not yet a red sign. In the case of the voluntary carbon market, and especially when we talk about certainty, we've given this policy a red traffic light because of the high uncertainty that actually investors face, specifically when we're talking about monitoring, reporting, and verification in the VCM that has yet to be fixed in order to actually work reliably. On the next slide, let me especially focus on the strategic fit of these policies. So the first question under this is at which TRL stage the policy can be applied in the most effective ways. And thinking about strategic fit, and I will also be talking about that on the next slide when we talk about how to fit these policies together. Actually, tax incentives, but also direct grants emerge as the most versatile policies, in the sense that tax incentives as well as grants can be applied at many TRL stages. Of course, the individual focus of the policy will differ and the design will differ, and yet the same instrument can be applied to many TRL stages. This is in contrast to, for example, integrating removals into emissions trading systems, and also carbon contracts for differences, which necessitates stronger technological maturity, such that these technologies already need to be sufficiently deployable to actually implement this integration. Okay, I think I will move on to the part where we discuss strategic fit in more detail across different TRL levels. So in this slide, based on the technology innovation literature, we developed a process diagram that maps different stages of technology readiness levels to some examples, CDR policies that actually are currently in these TRL levels. And we also try to think more consistently about which policies best apply at which stages and how they combine most effectively. So as I have already highlighted when I talked about the previous points, again, tax breaks and direct grants, as well as outright subsidies, emerge as actually deployable along the entire technology chain. Whereas ETS integration, also VCMs, and to an extent CCFDs are more readily or are better policies for later TLS stages when we see more developed technologies. And the main point that we want to bring across when we do this mapping is that indeed every TRL stage should have their own policies, and so policies should ideally evolve, become more specific as CDR technologies develop. Because I'm not able to talk about all of our main takeaways in the individual evaluation, I will now highlight some main takeaways from our individual policy evaluations and the policy interactions. And after that, I would like to talk a little bit about the UK case specifically. So a key takeaway is actually that mandatory compliance instruments are likely more effective at reaching net zero goals than are voluntary markets. Voluntary markets can actually be subject to the priorities of firms and investors. These can be quite volatile and may not always align with regulatory targets. So to reach net zero with more certainty, it would be, these don't necessarily seem like the right policies. Policies that target removal methods explicitly while also providing a high price per ton of carbon removed. And an example here would be the 45Q tax incentives, which has been quite effective at attracting investment, are probably quite effective. At the same time, talking about trade-offs, these policies may come at a very high cost to government and taxpayers and requiring close monitoring when these technologies mature to maintain cost efficiency and also to an extent fairness to taxpayers. Reliable price signals with relatively little risk of reversal are important to foster a stable market environment. And then as an example of that, I think everybody will already be thinking about the carbon contracts for difference, which actually provides a longer term price signal. And in contrast to that, policies that can be adjusted year on year, for example, tax incentives or grants, provide less certainty. In contrast, this price stability can be in tension with the ability to adjust for cost changes. So maintaining this balance in the case of CCFDs, for example, with repeated CCFD auctions that actually allows tracking how prices develop over time, might be a good idea to kind of ensure that this balance is maintained, and also that large windfall profits which might occur to producers or technology providers are avoided. Policy incidence is crucial for policy acceptance. However, as it will largely be an empirical question, since the pass-through of these policy costs often depends on market structures. However, a point that we highlight in the paper is that especially for large investments that are associated with DAX and BEX, there might be a very high risk of market concentration, which would lead to imperfect pass-through, which then means that much of the subsidy might be appropriated by the technology owners. So this is a space to watch as we see how these markets develop. Monitoring, reporting, and verification appears to be easier to ensure for mandatory compliance instruments, and I think I've highlighted this point earlier. But the VCM monitoring should be enhanced. And I think Francesca might be talking about that in a bit too. Administrative ease was also a criterion that we assessed under the feasibility. Administrative ease seems relatively hard to ensure for carbon contracts for differences or also emissions trading systems integration, since these policies actually build on quite elaborate market structures. So this seems to be a policy that is probably more applicable in countries of the global north and less so in countries of the global south. These countries might be finding grants or also tax incentives a bit easier to implement. And lastly, I spoke about the policy combinations. So ideally, policies should target different technology readiness levels and market barriers, and they should ideally be adjusted as these technologies mature. CORE is currently exploring more detailed work on policy sequencing. So my colleagues Siu and Josephs are working on that. So they will actually be building on this mapping, this policy sequencing diagram that I showed in a bit. And there's other work ongoing, also more detailed work on carbon contracts for differences. So really, we thought about this paper more as a kind of laying the scene and getting an overview of what actually happens within these different policies to then use this as an occasion to focus more deeply into each of them. So speaking a bit about the UK actually proposed the integration of removals into its emissions trading systems and also in combination with that, the carbon contracts for difference, with a particular emphasis on targeting BEX and DAX. And so the ETS integration encourages the deployment of CDR as a compliance mechanism. So that's already a great development. And then in combination with that, CCFDs can actually reduce the political and also the market uncertainty for investors, since CCFDs provide a fixed long-term price over the duration of the contract, and also is a great complement in that sense as a top-up price to ensure that these still larger costs of removals are met in the policy framework. As I highlighted earlier, integrating removals into the ETS actually requires careful adjustment and monitoring of the cap to prevent price erosion and also avoid mitigation deterrents. And I also spoke about the CCFD in the sense that it will be important to monitor to ensure that producers are not overcompensated, but also receive sufficient compensation at the same time. So this is a really tough balance. These policy incentives actually target most strongly the deployment of comparatively mature technologies. So this is useful considering the urgency of scaling up the deployment part. However, when we thought about this, when we prepared the paper, it would be good if the UK would also consider expanding support to other technologies, for example, technologies that are still in the earlier TRL stages like enhanced rock weathering or biochar. Probably without targeted investment, and of course not just in the UK, but in many countries via grants or tax incentives, these approaches will not reach the necessary scale in time. considering that 2050 seems already around the corner, especially when we talk about R&D, which can take a long time. This was a high-level overview of what we were working on when we discussed, when we were working on the working paper. The full version of the working paper will be linked on the slides that I think will be made available after the webinar. In addition, we developed a policy brief led by my colleagues Xiao Feng and Joseph Stemler, in which we have a more dense summary of the main messages of the policy paper, together with other work that was already conducted in core before, and which especially looks at CDR deployment. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Johanna. It's really helpful to see laid out like that, the kind of typology of different policies and the criteria to be thinking through, and some kind of initial thoughts on how different policies might perform. So over to Francesca now. Francesca, you're working at Carbon Gap. I know you and Carbon Gap are doing a lot on policy developments for removals in the UK, but the broader EU context as well. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on, what constitutes good removals policy from your point of view, and how might some of these issues be manifesting in an EU context and dovetailing with the various other climate policy objectives that are already in play in the EU, perhaps. So over to you.
Thank you, Steve. And yeah, I'd obviously like to thank Johanna and her team as well for this fantastic paper. I think, given where we are, the moment that we're in terms of CDR, GGR policy development, it's incredibly important to kind of take stock and have this analytical framework that helps us understand kind of where we're trying to get to and kind of the gaps that we need to bridge there. So really helpful. Just to briefly introduce myself and Carbon Gap, we are essentially a think tank focused exclusively on carbon removal policy. We see policy as our key lever for influencing responsible scaling of CDR, and we're really focused on European policy, including the UK, but also the EU as well. And our work really involves a combination of policy advocacy, but also policy tracking. And I'd encourage those who haven't to have a look at our policy tracker platform, which I think is quite relevant to this discussion, includes a whole range of kind of, information about different jurisdictions and what they're doing on CDR and the different approaches they're taking. But yeah, just to sort of provide my brief reflections on the paper, I think what it's really helpful in doing is setting out where we're at now and where we're trying to go. In terms of where we're at now, what we see at Carbon Gap is really that demand is the central challenge. And I think the paper sort of rightfully puts several demand side policies as kind of the center of this discussion. What we see in the present landscape is that voluntary-led activity is the main source of kind of that demand side activity for CDR, and we do see that as being a problem. This has probably been said many times before, and it was also laid out quite well in the State of CDR report, but there's very few kind of major large-scale buyers in the CDR market. It's actually dominated by one or two companies. Voluntary demand is fragile, it's fickle, it follows changing corporate preferences. There's not large-scale participation, so there's not sort of an alignment with the scale of deployment that we really want to see. But then also on the supply side, we see a number of challenges. The CDR supply is not sufficiently competitive, it's too expensive. We don't see deployment at the scale we need either. And so these are the different kind of challenges that policies are trying to address. In terms of then where we're trying to go, I think building on everything I've just noted, what we want to see is a long-term liquid demand side for CDR. And I think compliance markets really are the center of that, and what we're really sort of pushing for at a sort of policy advocacy level. So we want to see, maximized participation from corporates. We want to see that sort of predictable price signal, and in fact, policies that even provide a price for CDR at all, because one does not necessarily exist in many jurisdictions. And then, of course, a complementary policy toolbox that addresses the supply side as well. So then just thinking about kind of how we're actually trying to do that in practice and what we're seeing globally, as Johanna and team lay out in this paper, different policies are really suitable to different parts of this kind of scaling pipeline. And what we're seeing internationally is kind of different jurisdictions laying out different priorities in terms of those policies, and therefore addressing different components in a sort of somewhat piecemeal fashion. I think what the UK is doing is kind of laying out this long-term framework in terms of ETS integration and then the CFD, and really sort of laying that long-term commercial case. But then we obviously see a strong need for those early stage policies as well. So of course, as policy advocates, what we want to call for is everything. You know, we want to see these policies that support the early TRLs. We want to see policies that support the late TRLs, the large-scale deployment, the long-term compliance markets. But we're also in an economic environment where we can't necessarily have all those things. So that's kind of the tension of what we're facing in terms of policy advocacy. I think, again, another thing that the paper rightfully highlights is that while, you know, we do need to prioritize policies, and some are maybe more effective than others, and also some are better suited in different jurisdictions than others, we do need to consider how they work in tandem. You know, compliance markets are critical, but they don't work if there's no supply side policy to feed a pipeline of CDRs into those markets. On the other hand, if you have early stage research and innovation policy, if those projects aren't then able to get out of those environments and towards large scale, then really we see a lot of those efforts being wasted. And then in terms of kind of different jurisdictions, I think there's a real opportunity here for testing and policy innovation, as you highlighted, Steve. Different countries taking different approaches and then sharing best practice, but maybe also then taking the lead in maybe some of the early deployment, maybe some of the long-term standard setting, etc. But that also will link to kind of how internationalized the market is long-term. So some open questions there. But yeah, just to conclude, I think, you know, at Carbon Gap, we see demand as the #1 challenge, and compliance markets as a key tool to unlocking that arguably, you know, does suit best the long-term market, as the paper highlights, but can set a long-term framework that allows a range of other policies and initiatives to cascade from that. But we do strongly need to consider how those policies fit together, and do we have a pipeline that feeds into the type of CDR landscape we want to see in the future. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Just to say, I can see we've got 2 questions in the Q&A, so thank you very much to Leon and Vishal, but there's still plenty of time for other audience members. Please do chip in with your questions and we'll come to them very soon. First, Paul Davies, I'd like to hand over to you. I think you do a lot of your work working with policymakers, but also very closely working with the actual organizations that are looking at developing and deploying carbon removal technologies. So it'd be good to hear your take, and maybe the take from the sort of supplier side, the businesses that will be generating this stuff, on what's really needed and what would constitute good policy to help support that.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, well, maybe I'll just do sort of 3 things. Firstly, why people are not investing yet in GGRs at scale. Then looking at policy, and in my mind, I'll be pretty positive actually, which is I think joined up policy is what's needed, and I think there's a lot of initiatives which makes me feel we're at the cusp of something pretty enormous. And then quickly finish off with some reflections of, however, what's not happening that needs to happen to accelerate it. So just doing that in the 3 parts. The first one, building on Johanna's analysis. Why are people not investing? It's a variety of reasons, which I think the policy will then go on to address. But in particular, obviously, it's not economic, meaning that the revenue they're getting are not going to cover the costs of doing the capturing at the moment. It's a simple, you know, it's a function of a number of things, including obviously the carbon price. 2, it's not mandated. So for a large number of businesses, they'll do it when they're told to do it. And I agree with Francesca, it's, you know, voluntary is marvelous, but most companies maximize bottom line. They'll only do things when it's mandated. 3, it's not predictable. So the pricing that we're all aspiring to and the costs are actually unpredictable, in particular the carbon price. And maybe 4thly, it's not endorsed, meaning it's not yet clear or strong government support and public support to spend the money necessary and to develop the industry in a way that would make it much easier to fund all these things. And that's bothly a support of, you know, robust, saying the industry is robust and this is a good thing to do from the public sector, and support from the public. So those are the reasons why sort of broadly it's not happening. But the reason I'm optimistic is a combination of policies being introduced that I think working together gives us great hope. And if I just canter through those and why, therefore, I'm vaguely optimistic. First one, and I'll just put them into the headings trying to address those why they're not investing. Firstly, funding. Clearly, the CFD that Johanna mentioned, and I'm doing this in the UK context, by the way, just to clarify. The Contracts for Differences is a long-term government contract which makes it economic to invest in GGRs, CDRs. The thing with the CFD, so people know also, is that government will offer you a price to deliver those CDRs, and they will deduct the actual revenue you get. So the higher the carbon price, the better the revenue, the less expensive it will be to government. And I think there's a prospect that within a relatively short period of time, the CFDs offered by government might be costless to government. They could offer them to give stability because the price is high enough to cover the cost. And when we cross that point, that will be a real positive. Second one is that trust robustness thing, which is, are these truly robust long-term removals? And again, government has been contributing to that by it's doing work with the British Standards Institute to have a government policy on a detailed, good standard that what is a robust removal. And that will help the market, both voluntary and the business models of CFDs. Third one that less good, and I'll come back to this, is standards where I'd say product standards. So one of the things governments can do, instead of actually introducing pricing to make it economic, is just regulating, saying thou shalt not have a product with carbon in it. And when they do that, the whole industry has no choice but to change. And I'll come back to examples of things they could think about in a second. Fourth one is encouraging is advocacy. So a couple of recent things coming out, for instance, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, has recently updated its guidance, is in consultation at the moment, strongly advocating the large number of corporates that sign up to SBTI, that they think about carbon removals as and relatively imminent purchases as a way of becoming carbon neutral. And government has just released a voluntary carbon consultation. It's 6 principles, which again are doing strong advocacy for purchasing. So it's moving in the right direction to say thou shalt, or any virtuous should be introducing CDRs as a sensible element of a net zero strategy. Next one I'll call is protecting. One of the worries is if you impose carbon pricing and lots of costs, do you just basically screw all your businesses that everyone just offshores because you've made them expensive? And simultaneously with all of these things, government is, and at a European level, developing carbon border adjustment mechanism, effectively saying that anything imported must be to the same standard or would be taxed, so that you don't create a competitive disadvantage for your own companies by imposing carbon taxing and regulation. So that goes hand in hand. And lastly, creating stability. As I said, the volatility of carbon price is a problem. Well, the EU-UK alignment of carbon pricing will help stability, it'll help demand. And the intention now to allow GGRs as an allowable offset to people's ETS obligations will make a huge difference, because that means the compliance market, people who are paying carbon taxes, can now buy GGRs as an offset. And that will incentivize them to buy GGRs, and in particular do long-term contracts so they can fix their price of ETS. And those contracts will actually underpin investment from the other side. If I get a contract, I can finance a GGR project with that underpinning. So there's a lot of interrelated policy and regulation, which I think is giving us hope on funding, on standards, on advocacy, on integration, on carbon pricing. Given all that, I'm optimistic, but there's still lots to do. And very broadly, I would say, one, speed. How fast these things are actually introduced, how quickly they come into policy. We are talking about an industry that needs to be about 7 to 9 gigatons by 2050. you don't get to that level without starting pretty quickly now. So speed is of essence. Public support, it was great what they were saying on those consultations, but the general public's level of knowledge and support for this still needs work. And worryingly, in particular, has been the recent breakdown of political consensus on net zero. So a degree of negativity from the Tory party and outright hostility from reform. Those are issues that we need to worry about. Mandation, could we actually mandate? So, for instance, the coalition recommended not that ETS is allowed to buy GGRs as an offset, but actually it should be mandated to have a percentage of its ETS in GGRs. So actually forcing people to go into that market as a way of bumping up demand with zero cost to government. And then could they do more on product standards or mandation to products? And I'll give you an example. In energy from waste, years ago, you just had landfill, and government imposed a landfill tax, and overnight it became economic to build energy from waste plants, which are environmentally much better. Could we do the same again by mandating? There is a hidden cost to that to society, because if you mandated an energy from waste all do carbon capture, it will be in our local council tax because the price will go up. But it's not something that's explicit. It's something that the government could think about to push this along. So reasons to be cheerful, I think I'm hopefully clear, but there is more to do, and much more that I'm sure Francesca will recommend could be accelerated and mandated to make it even faster.
Thank you very much, Paul. Really, really interesting to hear. And I'm sensing a lot of shared agreement on the need to build up the demand side through these policy mechanisms, a lot of agreement on the fact that you need stability and also standards and standardization, sort of the importance of government backing certain types of things for their visibility and sort of assurance, commercially as well as just regulatory. I think that I'm going to try and find some hopefully during the Q&A we move to now, find some points of difference as well, because I think it'll be interesting. And I wonder whether this straight inclusion in the ETS and ability to use removals as an offset for emission might be one area. I think Carbon Gap has some interesting views there. But thank you, that really good interventions, and we got some really good questions. So let's try and get through a few of these. One question, I think, starting with you, Johanna. Leon, maybe sticking up for the voluntary carbon markets a bit more. So you pointed to them as being maybe less stable, more volatile. Taking the US as one particular example, is it the case that the voluntary carbon market is always going to be more volatile than certain regulatory regimes? Of course, we've seen huge change in attitudes to climate policy in the US. And when it comes to certification standards, is this not a shared problem across the entire system of structures, not just the voluntary market, but governments are going to have to wrap their head around that as well? So any thoughts on that from you, Johanna, and then maybe Fran and Paul, if you want to come in after.
Yeah, thank you, Leon, for these good questions. Yes, of course, as you highlight, government does not necessarily have to be more stable than any other investor. So in that sense, the distinction that I made in the presentations very strongly relied on governments actually being committed to net zero goals, and also being committed to ensuring that verification and the development of standards is actually in the interest of them. So that may not always be the case, and you highlight the case correctly. So in that case, if the government cannot be relied upon to do that, then of course voluntary markets can be a really good backup for investors who still want to contribute to net zero targets. What needs to be ensured, though, is that the prices on the voluntary carbon markets are not as scattered and distinct as they are currently. So currently we are seeing a range of different markets that don't necessarily align with the integrity of the removal credits that are being sold on them, and that these actually correspond to real emissions reductions or removals, and that we can be sure that if someone invests in them, that these are real investments. So in that sense, there's a lot of homework for the VCM if it should work as a backup mechanism, as you allude to, Leon. I would also be happy to comment on the questions on carbon contracts for differences. I think someone else might be better placed to comment on the very rapidly evolving space around the Article 6 negotiations. But I will leave it up to you to manage that. Thank you.
Well, yeah, let's move to the CFD questions. We've had a couple on those, and I think Paul and Francesca, you'll have clear views on this. So one of the questions from Gabriella is that they recognize that effective CDR policy must integrate both supply and demand side measures. But if we focus on CFDs specifically, what elements should they incorporate to ensure their supporting deployment? So what are the key aspects, the key details of a CFD that you think are crucial? And then maybe slightly more a conceptual question, which Johanna, you could have a go at addressing as well as the first one, which is a CFD effectively equal to the government doing a reverse auction for a contract and then selling the credit back onto the ETS? But I don't know whether Francesca, Paul, you want to zoom in on CFDs and say what specific things do you think are crucial to the contract design there to make this work? Paul.
It's pretty simple. The CFD, it just gives stability to investors. So it means it's an agreed known price payable by government for your output, which will include your cost of building and operating that plant, and including an agreed negotiated rate of return. So what the CFD does is and that's what the reason we've used CFD, and I was sort of instrumental in sort of recommending it to government. It's worked well in wind farms, in solar. So it is a way of giving that certainty, and that works well. The second component is deducting from the CFD that government's guaranteed to pay you for that price what you can actually earn in the market. And I think, and that works well because as that's deducted, it'll reduce the inherent subsidy from government. So getting those two right. I think the thing with government is it hasn't got much money. And so it needs to be comfortable that it is very likely, even if they give a CFD, we will be able to sell those credits. So I think in the CFD, it's great, it gives us stability, but it's incumbent on us all with good policy, but also us working with potential purchasers to show government we have got buyers so that the true cost of government is reduced to as minimal as it possibly can be. And the second it goes to zero, then they can give lots of those. And just one example, by the way, wind farms, the original CFD for wind farms, which is, I can't remember, it was about 150 pounds a kilowatt hour, was about the 150 price. They had continued competition. The cost of capital came down, the capex for each came down. We're now at 40 quid. So about a third of the price, maybe a quarter of the price. So a massive reduction in price through competition and learning by doing. That's what we want to try and replicate, so that now it's costless to government. The energy, the revenue you get is equal to the CFD price. That's what we want to replicate.
And Francesca, yeah, and also maybe a chance for you to reflect a little bit on this question of including removals in an ETS, because this is a conversation at an EU level as well as a UK level. So CFD, but plus this kind of broader, what's the reference price and what will be the market that removals ultimately plays in? It'd be good to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I wanted to answer more specifically the question on what can specifically be in a CFD to promote stability, because I think we also have to remember that the CFD in the UK will be strongly hinged on the BSI process, which will set a minimum quality threshold for, and then eventually a standard for how those projects operate. So clearly we'll see a need for stability in those requirements and a tension between kind of how those set best practice and then how those also kind of provide certainty to investors about how they should be operating. So that's kind of a key tension in the design of the CFD. But I think also in terms of how can they be most effective in providing confidence and investability in a CDR market, I think there's a question about who they're providing certainty for, because what we have currently is a CFD that will be bilaterally negotiated between a small pool of developers that we currently have in the UK and the government, and we don't have that kind of competitive dynamic that Paul was highlighting. And so we need to get to that long term. We need to get to a point where we have kind of competitively allocated CFDs amongst a sort of range of different CDR suppliers. In terms of the ETS and CFD interaction, yeah, I think that that Johanna's paper really perfectly highlights that this is a very, very strong long-term commercial framework that the UK is setting up for operating CDRs long term. And it's that point on policy interaction, because in the EU, we don't have a plan for a CFD. We're discussing ETS integration, but we don't have that plan for kind of topping up that price to reach the full cost of CDRs. And so there's then a question about which CDRs are going in, and what actually are you sort of what kind of portfolio are you stimulating through this ETS integration, and will you get maybe a cost minimizing effect where some of the cheaper CDRs go in rather than maybe those really high quality permanent ones that do cost more than the ETS price. So I think that's an important dynamic to note. But I don't know if there was a more specific question about kind of
just one thing on Greg's question in the chat, which is will a market-driven cap and trade scheme suffice? I think the answer is no. The price is simply too low. So in the EU context, without a CFD, the price at the moment would not incentivize investment in CDRs. That's the issue. And that's deliberate because, the economists have said cap and trade will lead to an increasing price, so the easy wins will be done first. But if you need to stimulate markets, which, engineered markets are more costly, we haven't got up the cost curve yet to a level where they're self-funding. That's the problem.
Johanna, yes, this conceptual question, is a CFD essentially the government buying removals through auctions and then selling them back onto a regulated market or a voluntary market?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so what has been highlighted a lot about CFDs in the previous discussion is the price stability and the long-term motive, right? So you provide essentially long-term price, be it 15 years, as in the example of some CFDs that are currently ongoing, although not for a CDR yet. What in another aspect of CFDs that Paul just highlighted is the one where you have a price top up, right? So because the removal technologies are still too expensive, it's not just a price stability, but it's also a price top up mechanism. And the difference between the reference price and the strike price will be the subsidy that the government pays to be it a company or an industry. So what is the good reference price for that? Well, it will be one that is not too low, so that governments do not end up overpaying. And another assumption that essentially the logic that Paul has just outlined is resting on is that the technology costs decrease sufficiently so that actually the gap between the technology cost and the reference price will be narrowing over time, and the reference price itself increases. And if you have a two-sided CFD, that can lead then to repayments by the firms, right? So then you might have a negative difference, and this is a big selling point of CFDs. What might happen is that actually this learning doesn't take place. We've been learning from renewables that these cost decreases can be quite stark, but for carbon dioxide removal technologies, we're not sure yet what the amount of cost decreases are. And so I think it really depends on the empirical question of cost development. On the question of whether this is the same as a reverse auction, it would be the same conceptually, but a main difference is, of course, that the government in the CFD is actually paying the firm, or often paying the firms directly, right? So the government has a contract with an individual firm, so the transaction is going that way. Of course, if you sell these credits back to the market, then you don't have this subsidy to a specific firm, which may or may not make CFDs a more attractive policy or a less attractive policy, depending on which government you are. So if domestic industry is to be supported more strongly, which may be in the interest of some governments indeed, then a CCFD would be not equal to what Leon is proposing in the chat.
Thank you. Two other questions, if we have super quick answers before we wrap up, because we're coming into land here. But one question from Peter about this balance between the transaction costs and the costs of going through the details, specifically on MRV. So Francesca, you mentioned that the British Standards Institute is developing some quite detailed specifications for which types of project might be allowed into the CFD structure in the UK. But obviously there's a lot of work to do there, and we're dealing a lot with very early stage companies. what do you have a sense about the right level of balance on kind of getting into the detail on MRV and setting standards versus actually building out new technologies and learning through doing? And also, I mean, you're all welcome to answer that one and maybe answer the other one asked by Philip, which was how can people get involved in developing the policy frameworks for these things? I assume, Francesca, you'd say talk to Carbon Gap, and Paul, you would say talk to Coalition for Negative Emissions, but you can differ there. Does anyone want to have a quick take on that? Yes, Francesca.
Yeah, I think so. I'll just go to the MRV question. I think that Carbon Gap would argue that the level of MRV that's available and that can be done should really determine the use case. And I think in the UK we have a very strong regulatory framework for permanent geological sequestration, and that's why we're kind of confident about integrating those types of methods into the ETS. But I think when it comes to earlier stage methods, the MRV or the sort of nascency of that should potentially dictate a different kind of use case for those methods. In the EU, there's discussion on a potential purchasing program, and we've kind of argued for such a program to really target innovation and be sort of use case agnostic to promote the development of those methods without necessarily kind of requiring this labor intensive accounting that could hold back their development. So yeah, targeting the MRV to the use case really.
Thanks, Paul.
I'm pretty positive about MRV in as much as with government doing the BSI work and we're all involved in those details, but it will be a clear guidance of what constitutes robust emissions, and therefore people looking at it will know what they need to do and how they fit in. So a lot of that groundwork is being done by government, which is helpful. So you've got that clarity on the outset. When it gets to actual projects, the MRV, there's the upfront, which is getting it registered and getting it verified, and then the MRV is relatively light after that, or could be if we've got good standards and maybe an annual review. So I think MRV will be a good balance. It won't be a sort of overly onerous.
And Johanna, from the basis of the work you've done, yeah, this interplay between sort of guaranteeing of standards, but also the complexity of MRV. Do you have any further thoughts on that one, or anything else? I'll give you the final word as the main speaker.
I think very many smart things have been said, so I think I will just leave it at that.
Well, that's very concise. Well, thank you very much to Johanna, Francesca, and Paul, and to all of you in the audience for listening in. I've certainly learned a few things, and I think we stand at a really interesting point of time where in the UK, but in many other countries, these policies are just starting to develop. So certainly as researchers like Johanna and myself, I think we're interested in getting hold of the data and seeing how these things actually work. And as Paul mentioned at the end, if we can sort of learn and take stock on a regular basis and improve as we go along, then hopefully the wider goal of meeting our climate targets in a sensible and sustainable and effective way can be realized. So it just leaves me to thank you all for attending and for supplying your questions and your thoughts. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar and putting it on the website so you and your friends can find that. And just to let you know that we have another webinar that's coming up very soon on Wednesday, the 2nd of July. Same time, 12 to 1 p.m. UK time. And that's going to focus on nature-based solutions. So this one was very much looking at the sort of geological end of things. We're going to the nature end of things. So tune in for that one if you're interested in that. We will be sending registration details for that session in the follow-up email that we sent to all of you who've been in the audience. So have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.